Tonight I want to read to you guys from the introduction of this 1852 Merriam-Webster dictionary. And we're going to read a section about the origin of language. We read in scriptures that God, when he created man, blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea." God afterward planted a garden and placed in it the man he had made, with a command to keep it and to dress it, and he gave him a rule of moral conduct, in permitting him to eat the fruit of every tree in the garden except one, the eating of which was prohibited. We further read that God brought to Adam the fowls and beasts he had made, and that Adam gave them names, and that when his female companion was made, he gave her a name. After the eating of the forbidden fruit, it is stated that God addressed Adam and Eve, reproving them for their disobedience, and pronouncing the penalties which they had incurred. In the account of these transactions, it is further related that Adam and Eve both replied to their Maker, and excused their disobedience. If we admit what is the literal and obvious interpretation of this narrative, that vocal sounds or words were used in these communications between God and the progenitors of the human race, it results that Adam was not only endowed with intellect for understanding his Maker, or the signification of words, but was furnished both with the faculty of speech and with speech itself, or the knowledge and use of words as signs and ideas, and this before the formation of the woman. Hence we may infer that language was bestowed upon Adam in the same manner as all other faculties and knowledge, by supernatural power, or, in other words, was of divine origin. For, supposing Adam to have had all the intellectual powers of any adult individual of the species who has since lived, we cannot admit as probable, or even possible, that he should have invented or constructed even a barren language, as soon as he was created, without supernatural aid. It may indeed be doubted whether, without such aid, men would ever have learned the use of the organs of speech, so far as to form a language. At any rate, the invention of words and the construction of a language must have been by a slow process, and must have required a much longer time than that which passed between the creation of Adam and of Eve. It is therefore probable that language, as well as the faculty of speech, was the immediate gift of God. We are not, however, to suppose the language of our first parents in paradise to have been copious, like the most modern languages, or the identical language they use to be now in existence. Many of the primitive radical words may and probably do exist in various languages, but observation teaches that languages must improve and undergo great changes as knowledge increases, and be subject to continual alterations, from other causes incident to men in society. A brief account of the origin and progress of the principal languages, ancient and modern, that have been spoken by nations between the Ganges and the Atlantic Ocean. We learn from Scripture that Noah, who with his family was preserved from destruction by the deluge, for the purpose of repeopling the earth, had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This fact, a little obscured by tradition, was retained by our rude German ancestors to the age of Tacitus. Japheth was the eldest son, but Shem, the ancestor of the Israelites and of the writers of the Scriptures, is named first in order. The descendants of Shem and Ham peopled all the Great Plain, situated north and west of the Persian Gulf, between that Gulf and the Indian Ocean on the east, and the Arabic Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea on the west, with the northern coast of Africa, comprehending Assyria, Babylonia, or Chaldea, Syria, Palestine, Arabia, Egypt, and Libya. The principal languages or dialects used by these descendants are known to us under the names of Chaldee or Chaldaic, which is also called Aramean, Syriac, Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopic, Samaritan, and Coptic. Of these, the Chaldee and the Hebrew are no longer living languages, but they have come down to us in books, and Samaritan is probably extinct, or lost in the modern languages of the country. But the language survives in a copy of the Pentateuch. The Coptic is nearly or quite extinct, and little of it remains. The Syriac, Arabic, and Ethiopic are yet living languages, but they have suffered and are continually suffering alterations, from which no living language is exempt. These languages, except the Coptic, being used by the descendants of Shem, I call Shemitic, or Assyrian, in distinction from the Japhetic. As the descendants of Japheth peopled Asia Minor, the northern parts of Asia, about the Euxine and Caspian, and all Europe, their languages have, in the long period that has elapsed since their dispersion, become very numerous. All languages having sprung from one source, the original words from which they have been formed must have been of equal antiquity. That the Celtic and Teutonic languages in Europe are, in this sense, as old as the Chaldee and Hebrew is a fact not only warranted by history and the common origin of Japheth and Shem, but susceptible of proof from the identity of many words yet existing in both stocks. But there is a marked difference between the Shemitic and Japhetic languages, for even when the radical words are unquestionably the same, the modifications or inflections and combinations which form the compounds are, for the most part, different. As it has been made a question which of the Shemitic languages is the most ancient, and much has been written to prove it to be Hebrew, I will state briefly my opinion on what appears to me to be one of the plainest questions in the history of nations. We have for our certain guides in determining this question. First, the historical narrative of facts in the book of Genesis, and second, the known and uniform progress of languages within the period of authentic profane history. 1. The scripture informs us that, before the dispersion, the whole earth was of one language and of one or the same speech, and that the descendants of Noah journeyed from the east and settled on the plain of Shinar, or in Chaldea. The language used at that time by the inhabitants of that plain must then have been the oldest or the primitive language of man. This must have been the original Chaldee. 2. The scripture informs us that in consequence of the impious attempts of the people to build a city and a tower whose top might reach heaven, with a view to make themselves a name and prevent their dispersion, God interposed and confounded their language, so that they could not understand each other, in consequence of which they were dispersed from thence over the face of all the earth. 3. If the confusion of languages at Babel originated the differences which gave rise to the various languages of the families which separated at the dispersion, then those several languages are all of equal antiquity. Of these, the Hebrew as a distinct language was not one, for the Hebrew nation was of posterior origin. 4. All the words of the several great races of men, both in Asia and Europe, which are vernacular in their several languages, and unequivocally the same, are of equal antiquity, as they must have been derived from the common Chaldee stock, which existed before the dispersion. The words common to the Syrians and Hebrews could not have been borrowed from the Hebrew, for the Hebrews originated from Heber and Abram, several centuries after Syria and Egypt were populous countries. This fact is attested by the scripture history, which declares that when Abram migrated from Chaldea and came into Canaan or Palestine, the Canaanite was then in the land, and when he returned from Egypt, the Perizzite dwelt in the land. These declarations in the history of Abimelech and the war of the 4 kings or chieftains with 5, as also of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, prove that Syria to have been at that time well peopled. The language of the inhabitants then must have been coeval with the nation, and long anterior to the Hebrew as a distinct dialect. It may be added that in the early periods of the world, when no books existed, nations, living remote or distinct, never borrowed words from each other. One nation living in the midst of another, as the Hebrews did among the Egyptians, may adopt a single word or a few words, but a family of words thus adopted is an occurrence rarely or never known. The borrowing of words in modern times is almost wholly from the use of books. 5. It is probable that some differences of language were produced by the confusion, but neither that event nor any supernatural event is necessary to account for the differences of dialect or of languages now existing. The different modern languages of the Gothic and Teutonic stock all originated in the natural course of events, and the differences are as great between them as they are between the languages of the Shemitic stock. 6. Soon after, 2 races of men of a common stock have separated and placed themselves in distant countries. The language of each begins to diverge from that of the other by various means. 1. One tribe or nation will suffer one word to become obsolete and forgotten. Another will suffer the loss of another. Sometimes a whole family of words will be lost. At other times, a part only. At other times, a single word only of a numerous family will be retained by one nation, while another nation will retain the whole. 2. The same word will be differently applied by two distant races of men, and the difference will be so great as to obscure the original affinity. 3. Words will be compounded by two nations in a different manner, the same radical words taking a different prefix or suffix in different languages. Thus, wisdom in English is in German Weisheit, from wise or vice. The English mislead is in Danish Forlader, from lead or leader. 4. The pronunciation and orthography of words will often be so much changed that the same word in two languages cannot, without difficulty, be recognized as identical. No person without a considerable attention to the changes which letters have suffered would at once suspect or believe the English let and the French laisser to be the same word. 7. As Abram migrated to Chaldea, he must have spoken the Chaldee language, and probably at that time the Syriac, Arabic, and Egyptian had not become so different as to render it impracticable for him to converse with the inhabitants of Palestine and Egypt. But the language of Abram's descendants and that of the land of Shinar, or the Chaldee, must in the natural course of things have begun to diverge soon after the separation, and the changes in each language, being different, would, in the course of a few centuries, form somewhat different languages. So in the days of Hezekiah, the Syriac and Hebrew had become, in a degree, distinct languages. Kings 18. In which of these languages the greatest number of alterations were produced, we do not know, but from the general observations I have made in my researches, it appears that the Chaldee dialect in the use of dental letters instead of sibilants is much the most general in the Celtic and Teutonic languages of Europe. Thus, the German only has a sibilant in Wasser, when the other Teutonic languages have a dental, water. I think also that there are far more words in the European languages which accord with the Chaldee or Arabic than there are words which accord with the Hebrew. If this observation is well founded, the Hebrew must have suffered the loss of more primitive words than the other languages of the Shemitic family. This, however, is true, that all of them have lost some words, and in some cases the Hebrew retains what the others have lost. 8. The Hebrew scriptures are, by many centuries, the most ancient writings extant. Hence probably the strange inference that the Hebrew is the oldest language, as if the inhabitants of Chaldea and Syria had had no language for ages before the progenitor of the Hebrews was born. 9. The vernacular words in the Celtic and Teutonic languages of modern Europe, which are evidently the same words as still exist in the Shemitic languages, are of the same antiquity, being a part of the common language which was used on the plain of Shinar before the dispersion. The descendants of Japheth peopled the northern part of Asia and all Europe. Or, if some colonies from Egypt planted themselves in Greece at an early period, they or their descendants must have been merged in the mass of Japhetic population. Certain it is that the Greek language is chiefly formed on the same radical words as the Celtic and Teutonic languages. The Japhetic tribes of men whose descendants peopled the south and west of Europe were first established in the country now called Persia, or, by the natives themselves, Iran. Of this fact, the evidence now existing is decisive. The numerous words found in the Greek, Latin, Gaelic, English, and the kindred tongues, which are still used in Persia, prove beyond all question that Persia must have been the residence of the people whose descendants introduced into Europe the languages from which the modern languages are derived. The fact proves further that a great body of the original Persians remained in their own country, and their descendants constitute the mass of the population at this day. In the early stages of society, men dwelt or migrated in families, tribes, or clans. The family of Abraham and Jacob in Asia, and the clans of the Gaels in Scotland, exhibit to us the manner in which societies and nations were originally formed. The descendants of a man settled around him and formed a clan, or tribe, of which the government was patriarchal. Such families often migrated in a body, and often the personal characteristics of the progenitor might be distinctly traced in his descendants for many generations. In process of time, some of these families became nations. More generally, by means of wars and migration, different tribes became blended and the distinction of families was lost. In rude ages, the families or tribes of men are named from some characteristic of the people, or, more generally, from the place of their residence. The Greeks have the name of Scythia to the north of Europe and Asia, but the primitive inhabitants of the west of Europe they call Celts, a word signifying woodsmen. These were descendants from the same ancestors as the Greeks and Romans themselves, but they had pushed their migration into Gaul, Spain, and Britain. The first settlers or occupiers of these countries were driven forward by successive hordes, until they were checked by the ocean. There they made their stand, and there we find their descendants at this day. These may be considered as the descendants of the earliest settlers or first inhabitants of the countries where they are found. Among these are the inhabitants of France, south of the Garonne, and those of the north of Spain, called the Romans Aquitani, in Canterbury. In more modern times, Gascoins, Basques, and Cantabrians, who still retain their native language, and in Great Britain, the Gaels in Scotland, and the natives of the north and west of Ireland, who also retain their primitive language. The first inhabitants of the north and west of Europe, known to the Greeks and Romans, to whom we are indebted for our earliest accounts of that region, were the Cimbri, who inhabited the peninsula of Denmark, now called Jutland, and the tribes which belonged to the Teutonic and Gothic races, which were established in Germany and on both sides of the Baltic. Whether tribes of Celtic origin had overspread the latter countries before the arrival of the Gothic and Teutonic races, and all Europe had been inhabited by the Celts, even to the borders of Sarmatia, has been a question much disputed by historians and antiquaries. The German and French writers generally contend that the Celts inhabited all the north of Europe, as far at least as Sarmatia, but some respectable English writers are of a different opinion. Now it is agreed that the Welsh are descendants of the Cimbri, inhabitants of Jutland, and their language bears a strong affinity to the Celtic languages, which still exist, a fact that countenances the opinion of the German and French writers. But the dispute is of little moment. The Celtic, Teutonic, and Gothic races being all of the Japhetic stock, migrating from Asia through Asia Minor at different times and pursuing different courses westward. The first tribes probably sought the warm climates along the north coast of the Mediterranean and established themselves in Greece and Italy. Others followed the course of the Danube and its subsidiary streams, till they fell upon the rivers that conducted them to the Baltic. The first inhabitants of Greece and Italy were probably of the Celtic race. But if they were, it is very evident that tribes of the Teutonic or Gothic races invaded those countries before they were civilized, and intermingled with the original inhabitants. The Pelasgi may have been among the number. This is an inference which I draw from the affinities of the Greek and Latin languages, which those of Teutonic origin. The Teutonic and Gothic races impressed their language upon all the continent of Europe, west of the Vistula, and from the river to the Rhine, or rather to the Seine, anterior to the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar. The same races, invading and conquering the south of Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries, on the downfall of the Roman Empire, infused a portion of their language into the Italian Spanish, which is still distinguishable. The ancient Sarmatia, including Poland and Russia, was probably peopled originally by races of men who passed into Europe by the country north of the Euxine. Their original residences was along the rivers Kur and Araxes, or on the mountains between the Euxine and the Caspian. The name of the Rus or Russians is clearly recognized in the Roxolani of Pliny and Ptolemy, and possibly the ancestors of this race may have entered Europe by Asia Minor. That the Teutonic races originally from Persia inhabited Asia Minor and migrated westward by that course is evident from the names which they impressed on mountains, rivers, and places. Such are the Cragus of Pliny, the Welsh and English crag, Perga in Pamphylia, now Berg or Bergen, Teambrek, the name of a small stream near the site of Troy, a word in which we recognize the English brook. It was contracted by the Greeks into Timbrius. It is admitted by all gentlemen acquainted with Oriental literature that the Sanskrit, or ancient language of India, the parent of all the dialects of that great peninsula, is radically the same language or from the same stock as the Greek and Latin, the affinities between them being remarkably clear and decisive. If so, the inhabitants of India and the descendants of the Celtic and Teutonic nations are all of one family and must have all migrated from one country after the separation of the nations of the Shemitic stock from those of the Japhetic race. Whether that country was Persia or Kashmir, or a country farther east, it is a point not easily determined. One important inference results from this fact, that the white men of Europe and the black or tawny men of India are direct descendants from a common ancestor. Of the languages of Europe, the Greek was first improved and refined, and next to that the Latin. The affinity between these languages and those of the west and north of Europe is very striking, and demonstrates their common origin. It is probable, however, that there are some words in the Greek derived from Africa, if Egyptian colonies were established in Greece, as historians inform us. The modern Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese are composed chiefly of Latin words, much altered, however, both in orthography and inflection. Perhaps 9/10 of all the words now found in those languages are of Latin origin, being introduced by the Romans, who held Gaul in subjection 5 or 6 centuries, and Spain much longer, or being borrowed from Latin authors since the revival of the letters. All these languages, however, retain many words of Celtic origin, their primitive language not having been entirely extirpated. In some instances, the same word has been transmitted through both channels, the Celtic and the Latin, and is yet retained. Thus, in French, seder, and in Italian, sedere, is directly from the Latin sedo, while the French congadere and Italian congadare are composed of the same word with a prefix derived from the Celtic and retained in the Welsh gada, to quit or to leave, which is Latin concedo. And this same verb probably appears also in keet, a word common to the Teutonic and to the Celtic languages. See conga in the dictionary. It must be observed further that the Spanish language contains some words of African origin, introduced by the Carthaginians before the Roman conquest of Spain, or afterwards by the Moors, who for several centuries were masters of that country. It contains also some words of Gothic origin, introduced by the Goths, who conquered that country at the downfall of the Roman Empire. The French also contains some words of Teutonic origin, either from the Belgic tribes, who occupied the country to the Seine at the time of Caesar's invasion, or from the Franks, who established the dynasty of the Merovingian kings in the 5th century, or from the Normans, who obtained possession of the northern part of that kingdom in the 10th century, or from all these sources. The German, Dutch, or Belgic, Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Swedish languages are of Teutonic or Gothic origin. They are all closely allied, a great part of the words in them all being the same or from the same roots, with different prefixes and affixes. There is, however, a greater difference between the Danish and Swedish, which are of the Gothic stock, and the German and Dutch, which are of the Teutonic origin, than between two languages of the same stock, as between the Danish and Swedish. The Norwegian, Icelandic, and some of the languages or dialects of Switzerland belong to the same stock, but of these I have no particular knowledge. The Basque or Cantabrian in Spain, the Gaelic in the north of Scotland, and the Hiberno-Celtic or native language of Ireland are the purest remains of the ancient Celtic. From a comparison of a vocabulary of the Gaelic and Hiberno-Celtic, I find little or no difference between them, and from a long and attentive examination of this language and of the language of Teutonic origin, I find less difference between them than most authors have supposed to exist. The Armoric or language of Brittany, in the northwest angle of France, and the Cornish in the southwest of England are also of Celtic origin. The Cornish is now extinct, but the Armoric is a living language. The English, as now spoken, is a language composed of words from several others. The basis of the language is Anglo-Saxon, or, as I shall for the sake of brevity call it, Saxon, by which it is closely allied to the languages of Teutonic and Gothic origin on the continent. But it retains a great number of words from the ancient languages of Britain, the Belgic and the Ligurian, and the Cymraeg or Welsh, particularly from the latter, and some from the Cornish. Caesar informs us that before he invaded Britain, Belgic colonies had occupied the southern coast of England, and the inhabitants of the interior, northern, and western parts were the ancestors of the present Welsh, who called themselves Cymri. and their country, Cymru, a name which indicates their origin from the Cimbri, inhabitants of the modern Denmark, and Cimbric Carinesi, now Jutland. The modern Welsh contains many Latin words introduced by the Romans, who had possession of Britain for 500 years, but the body of language is probably their vernacular tongue. It is more nearly allied to the languages of Celtic origin than to those of the Teutonic and Gothic stock, and of this British language, the Cornish and Armoric are dialects. I'm going to leave it there, you guys, but if you want to continue with this page, just pause your screen. But it's clear to see before the Civil War and before Charles Darwin, the truth was widely taught. And we see it laid out here exactly the way we know it to be true. And it's a shame that today we have just such the opposite of this. I want to thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.